The reactor made a sound that reactors should never make, a low, grinding moan that suggested metal was doing things metal had no business doing. Jonas Reeve, who'd been hauling freight across the outer reaches for 6 years and had developed a finely tuned sense for sounds that mean you're about to die, felt his stomach drop approximately 3 inches. "That's not good," he said to nobody in particular, since he was alone in the cargo bay of the Meridian's Hope, surrounded by 70 tons of mining equipment that was supposed to be delivered to HFY-7 approximately 10 minutes from now. His comm crackled with the kind of static that suggested something was interfering with transmissions on a molecular level. Through the interference, he caught fragments of panicked voices speaking varying, the harsh, clicking language that his translator software struggled to parse during comm moments and had absolutely no chance with now. Containment failure in sector. Evacuation protocols. Estimate 7 minutes before. The transmission cut off entirely, replaced by the emergency frequency alarm that meant someone had just declared a colony-wide crisis. Jonas was already moving, leaving his cargo checklist floating in midair as he sprinted toward the cockpit. Through the viewport, HFY-7 filled his vision, a gray, utilitarian mining colony built into the surface of a moon that had been stripped of anything valuable decades ago, and now served primarily as a processing center for ore from surrounding asteroid fields. The colony's reactor complex, visible as a cluster of domed structures on the moon's dark side, was flickering with light that pulsed in a pattern Jonas recognized from emergency training he'd hoped never to use. Cascade failure. His translator finally caught up with the emergency broadcast. "All personnel evacuate immediately. Reactor containment breach imminent. Repeat, all personnel." Jonas did some very quick mental math that involved radiation dispersal patterns, evacuation times, and the carrying capacity of the colony's emergency shuttles. The numbers were bad, really bad. He opened a channel to the colony's command center, hoping someone was still there to receive it. "This is Captain Jonas Reeve of the freight vessel Meridian's Hope. I'm reading a containment breach in your reactor complex. What's your status?" A voice responded, female and strained, speaking standard with a heavy varying accent. "Captain Reeve, you need to leave the area immediately. We're evacuating, but the reactor—" A pause filled with background chaos. "The manual override is jammed. We can't access the containment chamber. We have maybe 6 minutes before the whole thing goes critical." "How many people are left in the evacuation?" 3,000, but the shuttles can only take 2,000 in the time we have. We're trying to—" Her voice broke slightly. "We're trying to decide who stays." Jonas stared at the reactor complex, at the flickering lights that meant containment fields were failing in sequence. He thought about 3,000 people trying to fit into 2,000 shuttle seats. He thought about the 1,000 people who would draw the unlucky lot, who would stand on the surface of this gray moon and watch the shuttles leave, and know they had approximately 4 minutes of life remaining. He thought about how his mother had raised him to be a decent person even when it was inconvenient. What would it take to manually override the containment system? He asked, already knowing he was going to regret this conversation. The varying woman's voice went very quiet. "Physical access to the reactor core. Someone would have to get into the maintenance shaft, bypass the safety locks, and manually reinitialize the magnetic containment. But the radiation levels in there right now," she stopped. "Anyone who went in wouldn't come out, not alive. But it would work. It would stop the cascade." "Yes, but—" "Send me the access codes and the override procedure. I'm already suited up." This was a lie. He was wearing his normal flight jacket and pants that had a concerning coffee stain on the left knee. "Captain Reeve, I cannot ask you to." "You're not asking, I'm volunteering. Send me the codes." There was a pause that felt like it lasted several years. Then, transmitting now, "May the ancestors guide you, human." Jonas pulled on his environmental suit, with movements made clumsy by the fact that his hands were shaking slightly. The suit's radiation shielding was rated for normal space hazards, solar flares, cosmic rays, the occasional hot asteroid. It was absolutely not rated for standing next to a failing reactor core while manually overriding containment systems. The Meridian's Hope touched down on the moon's surface with all the grace of a brick being dropped into a lake. Jonas didn't bother with proper landing procedure. He just aimed for flat ground near the reactor complex and hoped his shock absorbers were up to the task. They were, mostly. Something in the landing gear made an expensive-sounding crunch, but that was a problem for future Jonas, assuming future Jonas existed. Present Jonas grabbed his toolkit and sprinted toward the reactor complex, following the emergency lighting that strobed red against the gray lunar regolith. The main entrance stood open, abandoned in the evacuation chaos. Emergency klaxons wailed in frequencies that made his teeth ache. The maintenance shaft was exactly where the varying woman had said it would be, behind a door marked with radiation warnings in 17 different languages. Jonas appreciated the thoroughness even as he overrode the safety locks and opened the door to reveal a vertical tunnel descending into the heart of the reactor complex. He climbed down the ladder, his suit's dosimeter beginning to click with increasing frequency. The sound was almost conversational, click, 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 like someone tapping their fingers impatiently, waiting for him to realize what a spectacularly bad idea this was. The reactor core chamber was beautiful in a terrible sort of way. Magnetic containment fields flickered like aurora, holding back energies that wanted very badly to become an explosion. Warning lights painted everything in shades of red and amber. The air, if it could still be called air at these radiation levels, shimmered with ionization. Jonas found the manual override panel, pulled up the procedure on his wrist display, and got to work. His hands moved through the sequence of bypasses and resets, each step carefully explained in technical varying that his translator rendered into instructions like rotate the crystalline matrix 45 degrees clockwise and engage the backup containment field before disengaging primary. His dosimeter had stopped clicking and started screaming, a high-pitched whine that meant he was accumulating radiation dose at a rate that would have interesting medical consequences, assuming he lived long enough to experience them. The containment field stabilized with a sound like the universe sighing in relief. The amber warning lights shifted to yellow, then green. The cascade failure, against all probability, reversed itself. Jonas climbed back up the maintenance shaft, his legs feeling like they'd been replaced with rubber, and emerged into the main corridor to find the varying woman from the comm transmission standing there with an expression of absolute shock. "You're alive," she said, as if this violated several laws of physics. "For now," Jonas agreed, checking his dosimeter and trying not to think too hard about the numbers displayed there. "You should probably evacuate me to your medical facility. I'm going to need some fairly aggressive decontamination and possibly a new liver." 6 hours later, after medical procedures that Jonas tried very hard not to think about, he was sitting in a hospital bed being informed by a parade of increasingly important varying officials that he was a hero, that he'd saved 3,000 lives, that the colony owed him a debt that could never be fully repaid. Jonas, who was mostly just tired and slightly nauseous from radiation treatment, kept insisting he'd just done what needed doing, and could everyone please stop making such a big deal about it. The varying, it turned out, were not culturally equipped to handle humble heroism. They needed to make a big deal about it. Their honor demanded it, which was how, 3 days later, Jonas found himself being informed by a very nervous human diplomatic attaché that the varying council of matriarchs had invoked something called the right of claiming. "It's a very old tradition," the attaché explained, wringing his hands in a way that suggested this conversation was going to get worse. "When someone performs a great service, they're offered a great reward. In this case, 2 of their finest warriors have been selected to stand as living honors. You'll choose one to accompany you as companion and ally. Jonas stared at him. I'm sorry, what? You pick one of two alien women to travel with you. It's considered a tremendous honor for both you and the chosen warrior. And the one I don't pick returns to her normal duties. No dishonor, but, well, there's a certain weight to being unchosen. Jonas rubbed his face with both hands. So I saved a colony and now I'm being set up on the galaxy's most awkward blind date. Great, just great. The attaché's expression suggested this was, if anything, an understatement. The Grand Hall of Thessaroman 7 had been constructed by varying engineers, who believed that architecture should inspire awe and mild intimidation in equal measure. Vaulted ceilings stretched upward into shadows where bioluminescent panels created the impression of a night sky. Columns carved from local stone rose at precise intervals, each one etched with historical records of the colony's greatest achievements, rendered in flowing, varying script. Jonas walked down the central aisle feeling approximately as comfortable as a fish being asked to give a lecture on mountaineering. His flight jacket had been cleaned. Someone had even managed to remove the coffee stain, though they'd replaced it with a scorch mark that hadn't been there before, and his boots had been polished to a shine that seemed excessive for someone who spent most of his time in cargo holds. The crowd filled every available space. Varying faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. Apparently watching a human navigate their cultural traditions was considered premium entertainment. At the far end of the hall, elevated on a ceremonial platform, stood three figures. The center position was occupied by High Matriarch Thessara Velkorthan, an elderly varying woman whose posture suggested that time had made her more formidable rather than less. She wore formal robes in deep purple, with metallic threading that caught the light in complex patterns. On either side of her stood the warriors. Lieutenant Kairos Veltherin occupied the left position, her ice-blue skin marked with silver patterns that identified her family lineage. She stood with military precision, spine straight, hands clasped behind her back, her face a mask of stoic dignity. Her eyes, large and dark, with the slight glow that marked Varying as low-light specialists, tracked Jonas's approach with the kind of attention that suggested she was calculating approximately 17 ways to kill him if necessary. Sergeant Velena Keith stood on the right, her copper-toned skin darker than Kairos's, with bronze markings that formed aggressive geometric patterns across her visible arms and neck. Where Kairos projected cool calculation, Velena radiated controlled intensity. Her jaw was set in a way that suggested she was chewing on words she wasn't allowed to say. Neither woman looked particularly happy about the situation. Jonas reached the platform and executed what he hoped was a respectful bow. The High Matriarch acknowledged him with a slight inclination of her head, then began speaking in formal Varying that his translator rendered with ornate phrasing. Captain Jonas Reeve of Earth, you stand before the Council of Matriarchs as one who has earned the gratitude of Thessaroman 7 through actions that preserved 3,000 lives. Such a debt cannot be repaid with mere material wealth. Therefore, we invoke the ancient right of claiming, wherein two of our finest warriors stand as living honors, bound by sacred oath to serve as testament to varying gratitude. The matriarch gestured to Kairos and Velena, who both maintained their rigid postures. You must choose one woman to bind to your service, to travel with you, to stand as living testament to our appreciation. The chosen warrior will accompany you as companion and ally for 1 year, or until you release her from this obligation. The unchosen will return to her duties with honor intact, bearing no shame. Jonas listened carefully, his mind working through implications. He raised his hand slightly, the gesture feeling absurd in this formal setting. May I ask questions? The matriarch's expression suggested this was not typical protocol, but she nodded. So basically I'm supposed to pick one person over another based on what exactly? Physical appearance, combat record, who smiles more. A ripple of surprised murmuring ran through the assembled crowd. Apparently humans asking clarifying questions was not part of the traditional script. "The choice is yours alone," the matriarch said slowly. "You may use whatever criteria you deem worthy. This is your reward, Captain. Choose as you will." Jonas walked toward the platform, his boots loud against the polished stone floor. He studied both women not with the appraising gaze of someone shopping for property, but with careful attention, as if trying to read small print in poor lighting. He stopped in front of Kairos first. Up close, he could see the tension in her shoulders despite her controlled posture, the way her fingers were pressed just slightly too hard against each other behind her back. "If you weren't standing here right now," he asked quietly, "what would you be doing?" Kairos blinked, the first crack in her stoic mask. The question had clearly not been part of her preparation. After a moment that felt longer than it was, she answered, "Training new recruits in tactical operations. We have a class of junior officers who need instruction in orbital combat scenarios." Jonas nodded, filed that information away. He moved to Velena, who watched his approach with the intensity of someone tracking a potential threat. "Same question. If you could be anywhere else right now, what would you be doing?" Velena's jaw worked for a second before she answered. "Teaching hand-to-hand combat to junior officers. Someone needs to make sure they don't get themselves killed in close quarters." "You both train others," Jonas observed. "You're teachers." "We're warriors," Velena corrected, though her tone had shifted slightly, less hostile than before. "Warriors who teach," Jonas said. "That's not nothing." He walked back to the center of the platform, aware that several hundred people were watching him, that this moment would be recorded and analyzed and probably turned into cultural studies material for some xenoanthropology course somewhere. He looked at the High Matriarch. "I can't do this," he said. The murmuring in the hall increased in volume. The matriarch's expression remained neutral, but her ears tilted forward, a varying gesture that indicated either interest or warning. "You refuse the right?" she asked carefully. "I refuse to treat people like prizes in a contest they didn't sign up for," Jonas clarified. "Both of these women are clearly skilled, intelligent, and deserving of respect. Making me choose between them like I'm picking produce at a market feels fundamentally wrong." The silence that followed Jonas's statement felt like a physical presence, pressing down on the hall with uncomfortable weight. The High Matriarch's expression cycled through several variations of diplomatic concern, before settling on something that might have been respect, or might have been the face someone makes when trying to solve a math problem that keeps changing its variables. "Captain Reeve," she said carefully, each word measured like expensive spice being rationed during a shortage. "I understand that human cultural values may differ from our own, but the right of claiming has been part of varying tradition for 3 centuries. The honor." "I understand honor," Jonas interrupted, then immediately regretted interrupting a High Matriarch in front of her entire colony. "Sorry, what I mean is, I respect that this is important to your culture. But where I come from, treating people as rewards, even as honored rewards, sits wrong. Both Lieutenant Kairos and Sergeant Velena are clearly accomplished individuals who have earned their positions through skill and dedication. Reducing them to a binary choice feels like it diminishes that." Velena made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, or might have been her trying not to say something that would get her court-martialed. The matriarch leaned forward slightly. "Then what do you propose? The debt remains. Varying honor demands recognition of your service." Jonas took a breath, aware that what he was about to suggest would either be brilliant or catastrophically offensive, with very little middle ground between the two. Why does someone have to be rejected? If both warriors are willing, and that's a big if, I'm not assuming anything about what they want, why can't both of them accompany me as equals? The reaction was immediate and loud. Varying officials began talking over each other in rapid-fire clicks and consonants that his translator gave up on parsing. The High Matriarch held up one hand for silence, and the hall gradually complied, though the tension remained thick enough to cut with a plasma torch. "Such an arrangement has never been proposed," she said slowly. "The rite involves choosing one warrior, establishing clear hierarchy. What you suggest would imply both warriors are of equal value, which—" She trailed off, clearly working through implications in real time. "Which contradicts your whole competitive honor system," Jonas finished. "I get it, but respectfully, maybe that system needs some updating if it forces artificial hierarchy onto genuine respect." A council member to the matriarch's left stood abruptly. "This is absurd. The human seeks to claim both warriors out of greed." "I'm not claiming anyone," Jonas said firmly. "I'm suggesting that if we're going to do this reward thing, we do it in a way that doesn't require anyone to feel like second place. If Lieutenant Kairos and Sergeant Velena are both willing to travel with me, and again, that's entirely their choice, then we figure out an arrangement where everyone is treated as an equal participant rather than prize and consolation prize." The matriarch turned her attention to the two warriors, who had been standing in rigid silence throughout this entire exchange. "Lieutenant Kairos, Sergeant Velena, you have heard the humans' proposal. What say you?" This, apparently, was not protocol either. Asking the warriors for their input seemed to surprise everyone, including Kairos and Velena themselves. Kairos broke her military posture for the first time, turning slightly to look at Velena across the platform. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of their shared predicament. They'd both been standing here being discussed like furniture, both prepared for the possibility of rejection, both trapped in a tradition that honored them while simultaneously objectifying them. Velena was the first to move. She stepped forward, addressing the matriarch directly with a voice that carried clearly across the hall. "High Matriarch, if the human wishes to honor both of us equally, and if my sister warrior agrees, I will accept this arrangement." Every eye in the hall shifted to Kairos, who stood in silence for a moment that seemed to stretch infinitely. Jonas could see her working through calculations, social, political, personal, trying to determine the right move in a situation that had gone completely off script. Finally, she nodded once, a precise military gesture. "I agree to the modified arrangement." The hall erupted again, but this time the tone was different, less scandalized, more excited. People were witnessing something unprecedented, and varying culture valued precedent almost as much as it valued honor. The High Matriarch raised her hand for silence again, and this time it took longer to achieve. When the noise finally subsided, she spoke with the weight of someone making a decision that would be analyzed by historians for generations. "Tradition serves honor, not the reverse. There is no honor in forcing false hierarchy upon genuine respect. I approve the modification to the right of claiming. Let it be recorded that Captain Jonas Reeve has chosen to honor both warriors equally, and that both warriors have accepted this arrangement of their own accord." She gestured to a ceremonial official who looked like he was having a small crisis, probably because he was being asked to perform a ritual that had never been performed this way before. The official fumbled with a data tablet, scrolling through ceremonial texts, and making what Jonas assumed were frantic notes about how to adapt 300-year-old language to a three-person oath. "Captain Reeve, Lieutenant Kairos Vel Theron, Sergeant Velena Sor Keith," the matriarch intoned, "approach the binding circle." Jonas stepped forward. After a brief hesitation, Kairos and Velena descended from their elevated positions and joined him in the circular pattern inlaid into the floor at the center of the platform. Up close, Jonas could see more details. Kairos's silver markings included geometric patterns that suggested mathematical precision, while Velena's bronze markings had an organic, flowing quality that seemed at odds with her intense personality. The ceremonial official cleared his throat nervously and began reciting the oath, pausing occasionally to insert modifications. "Do you, Captain Jonas Reeve, accept the companionship of these warriors as equals in recognition of the debt owed?" I do, Jonas said, feeling slightly ridiculous but also aware that this mattered. That ceremony mattered even when you were making it up as you went. Do you, Lieutenant Kyrus Veltharin, accept this bond freely and with honor? I accept freely and with honor, Kyrus said, her voice steady. Do you, Sergeant Velena Keith, accept this bond freely and with honor? I accept freely and with honor, Velena echoed. The official produced 3 crystalline tokens, each one glowing faintly with bioluminescent material. He handed one to each of them. These tokens represent your oath. While you carry them, you are bound by the commitment you have made. The bond will last 1 year unless dissolved by mutual agreement. Speak now if any among you has objection to these terms. Nobody spoke. Jonas turned the crystal over in his hand, watching the light shift within it, and wondered what exactly he'd just gotten himself into. The ceremony concluded with formal words about honor and duty and tradition that Jonas tried to pay attention to, but mostly just washed over him in a wave of relief that they'd gotten through this without any diplomatic incidents. The crowd began to disperse, conversations erupting across the hall as people processed what they'd witnessed. Kyrus and Velena remained in the binding circle, looking at each other with expressions Jonas couldn't quite read. Finally, Velena broke the silence with a rough laugh. Well, this will be interesting. That is one word for it, Kyrus agreed dryly. Jonas looked between them, these 2 warriors who just agreed to leave their normal lives and accompany a human freight pilot into uncertain territory. For what it's worth, I really am sorry about the awkwardness of all this. I couldn't pick between you. It felt wrong. It was wrong, Velena said bluntly. The rite is supposed to honor warriors, but it always felt more like being livestock at auction. At least this way, we're not competing against each other. Kyrus nodded slowly. Agreed, though I suspect the logistics of this arrangement will prove challenging. My ship sleeps 1, Jonas admitted. We're going to need to figure out living arrangements, among other things. Then I suggest we start with a planning session, Kyrus said, falling back into tactical mode like it was a comfortable uniform. We have equipment to pack, duties to transfer, and approximately 24 hours before we're expected to depart. Efficient, Jonas observed. I'm told it's a varying trait. Kyrus's expression might have been a smile, though it was subtle enough that Jonas couldn't be entirely sure. As they left the grand hall together, Jonas caught sight of the High Matriarch watching them with an expression that combined approval and curiosity. She caught his eye and gave him the smallest nod, acknowledgement perhaps, that sometimes breaking tradition was the most honorable thing you could do. Jonas nodded back, then followed Kyrus and Velena into the corridors of Thessaroman 7, wondering how you fit 3 people and their complicated feelings about ceremonial obligation into a cargo ship designed for solitude. He suspected he was about to find out. The Meridian's hope had been built with efficiency in mind, which meant that every cubic meter of space served a purpose, and luxury was defined as having enough room to turn around without hitting something important. Jonas stood in what passed for the living quarters, a space that included a bunk, a small table, a hygiene station, and storage compartments, and tried to visualize how 3 people were supposed to exist here without going insane. Velena entered first, ducking slightly through the doorway despite having adequate clearance. Her eyes scanned the space with the automatic assessment of someone trained to evaluate tactical positions. Cozy, she said, in a tone that suggested cozy was not actually a compliment. Kyrus followed, carrying a regulation military pack that looked significantly more organized than Jonas's own luggage had ever been. She set it down carefully and stood with her hands clasped behind her back, studying the space with analytical attention. The bunk is sized for a single human. We will need additional sleeping arrangements. Already contacted a supply depot on the next station, Jonas said, pulling up a holographic display from his wrist comm. We can install 2 collapsible bunks in the cargo bay. It's not ideal, but there's enough room if we rearrange some storage. I've slept in worse locations, Velena said. At least this ship has functional life support. Setting the bar nice and low, I appreciate that, Jonas replied. They spent the next several hours in a complicated dance of spatial logistics, trying to create a living situation that wouldn't immediately lead to someone getting shoved out an airlock. The cargo bay was reorganized with precision that Jonas had never bothered with during his solo freight runs. Kairos calculated optimal placement for the additional bunks, using some kind of spatial algorithm that Jonas didn't fully understand, but appreciated the results of. Velena contributed by moving heavy equipment with casual strength that made Jonas feel like he should probably work out more. The first meal was awkward in ways that had nothing to do with logistics and everything to do with three strangers trying to figure out how to be comfortable around each other. Jonas had prepared human food, pasta with a sauce that he'd learned to make from shelf-stable ingredients, and wasn't sure how varying physiology would handle it until Kairos took a careful bite and nodded approval. Adequate, she said, which Jonas was learning was high praise in varying assessment. Better than military rations, Velena added, eating with the efficient speed of someone who'd learned not to waste time during meals. So, Jonas said, trying to fill the silence that was becoming oppressive, tell me about yourselves. I mean, beyond the titles and the warrior stuff. What do you actually do when you're not standing around being ceremonially honored? Kyra set down her utensil with precise placement. I develop tactical simulations for training purposes, combat scenarios that adapt to student responses, creating dynamic learning environments. You're a programmer, Jonas said, surprised. I'm a tactical officer who programs, Kairos corrected, though her tone was mild. The distinction matters in varying military hierarchy. Velena snorted. She's being modest. Kairos designed the simulation software that half the fleet uses for combat training. She just doesn't like talking about it because varying culture values physical prowess over intellectual achievement. That's an oversimplification, Kairos said, but she didn't deny it. Jonas turned to Velena. And you, when you're not teaching people how to break things efficiently. I maintain historical combat records. Old fighting techniques from before we developed modern weapons. Someone needs to preserve the traditional methods. She paused. Also, I collect music from pre-spaceflight civilizations. It's a hobby. Music. Jonas hadn't expected that. Velena's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been defensiveness. Violent people can appreciate art, Captain. We're not all about breaking bones and tactical analysis. I wasn't, Jonas stopped, reconsidered. Actually, that's fair, I was making assumptions. What kind of music? The tension in Velena's shoulders eased slightly. Percussion-heavy compositions, mostly. There's a particular region of Old Varying where they developed drum patterns that could communicate across distances before we had radio technology. The complexity is fascinating. They talked through the meal, the conversation gradually becoming less stilted as they found topics that didn't involve ceremony or obligation. Kairos revealed a dry sense of humor that emerged when she analyzed the tactical incompetence of characters in popular entertainment. Velena demonstrated an impressive ability to tell stories about training accidents that were simultaneously horrifying and funny. Jonas contributed his own tales of freight-hauling mishaps, including the time he'd accidentally transported a cargo container full of live amphibians who'd escaped and taken up residence in his ship's ventilation system for 3 weeks. How did you resolve it? Kairos asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. I landed on a swamp planet and opened all the external hatches, figured they'd find their way out eventually. Did they? Most of them. I still find the occasional descendant in weird places. There's a whole colony living behind the navigation console. Velena laughed, an actual full laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised Jonas. You're telling me this ship has a native amphibian population. I prefer to think of them as crew members who don't pay rent. The first week proved that close quarters with strangers was exactly as challenging as anticipated, but in unexpected ways. The biggest issue wasn't personality conflicts, but rather completely different assumptions about personal space and social interaction. Varying warriors apparently didn't have the same concept of privacy that humans did. Kairos would walk into whatever space Jonas occupied and start talking about tactical considerations without preamble, assuming that if he was visible, he was available for conversation. Velena had a habit of working out in common areas wearing minimal clothing, which wouldn't have been a problem except that Jonas kept accidentally walking in, and then trying to leave, and then having to explain that he wasn't fleeing. He just had human cultural baggage about nudity. "Your species is very strange about bodies," Velena observed after the third such incident. "Your species is very comfortable with bodies," Jonas countered. "We're warriors. Bodies are tools. Why would we be uncomfortable with tools?" But Jonas didn't have a good answer for that, so he just adjusted his schedule to work out at different times and tried not to overthink things. Kairos proved invaluable when they encountered pirates in the outer reaches 2 weeks into their journey. Jonas had been hauling legitimate cargo through a region known for smuggling, and apparently someone had decided that a single freight ship was an easy target. 3 ships emerged from hiding spots among the asteroid field, broadcasting demands for cargo transfer in language that was more threats than negotiation. "Tactical assessment?" Jonas asked, his hands already moving across the flight controls. Kairos was at the secondary console, her fingers dancing across holographic displays with practiced speed. 3 vessels, light armament, pilots displaying aggressive posture but predictable attack patterns. They're expecting easy prey. Recommendations: continue on current course. When they close to weapons range, execute a sudden deceleration and 90-degree roll to port. Their formation will overshoot, giving us approximately 8 seconds before they can reorient. 8 seconds to do what? Reach the gravity well of that large asteroid at bearing 273. If we can position it between us and them, their tracking systems will struggle with the gravitational interference. Jonas trusted the assessment and executed the maneuver exactly as Kairos described. The pirate ships overshot their position, exactly as predicted. The Meridian's Hope dove toward the asteroid, using its gravity to slingshot around to the far side while the pirates struggled to compensate. "They're splitting up," Kairos reported. 2 pursuing, 1 trying to cut us off on the far side. "What's the one cutting us off armed with?" "Scanning. Plasma cannons, short range, requires close approach for effective targeting." "So we don't let it get close." They played a high-speed game of 3-dimensional chess among the asteroids for 20 minutes, with Kairos predicting pirate movements 3 steps ahead, and Jonas flying with precision that he didn't know he possessed. Eventually, the pirates gave up and retreated, probably concluding that this particular freight ship was more trouble than it was worth. When they finally cleared the asteroid field and jumped to FTL, Jonas realized he was shaking slightly from adrenaline. "That was intense." "That was adequate piloting," Kairos said, but there was something in her tone that might have been approval. "You trusted my tactical analysis without hesitation. That's unusual. You clearly knew what you were talking about." "Why wouldn't I trust you?" "Most pilots prefer their own instincts over external input, even from tactical specialists." "Most pilots are probably more experienced than me," Jonas admitted. "I'll take expert advice over my own guesswork any day." Kairos nodded slowly, and Jonas had the sense that he just passed some kind of test he hadn't known he was taking. The incident with the cargo dispute happened on a frontier station called Broken Reach, a name that accurately described both its legal status and its structural integrity. Jonas had delivered mining equipment and was in the process of negotiating payment when the station administrator suddenly decided that the agreed-upon price was subject to renegotiation based on market fluctuations. Market fluctuations apparently meant I have armed friends and you don't, so I'm going to pay you half what we agreed. Jonas was in the middle of explaining, with admirable patience, why contract law still applied even on lawless stations, when the administrator's armed friends decided to make their presence more obvious by surrounding him in the cargo bay. Velena, who'd been conducting equipment inventory in the back of the bay, assessed the situation with one glance and moved. What followed happened faster than Jonas could fully process. Velena disabled the first two guards with strikes that were almost casual in their efficiency. One elbow to a throat, one sweep that put the second guard on the floor gasping. The third guard was reaching for a weapon when Jonas, acting on instinct rather than thought, grabbed a cargo hook and swung it into the guard's knee. The guard went down. Jonas and Velena ended up back-to-back, facing the remaining 4 guards and the increasingly nervous station administrator. Renegotiation declined, Velena said pleasantly. You will pay the agreed amount, or we will continue this discussion in a manner you won't enjoy. The administrator, realizing that his intimidation tactic had backfired spectacularly, authorized the full payment with shaking hands. Later, back on the ship, Velena was checking her knuckles for bruising when she glanced at Jonas. You fight adequately for someone without formal training. I hit a guy with a cargo hook. That's not fighting, that's flailing with a nearby object. You assessed the tactical situation, identified the threat and neutralized it using available resources. That's exactly what fighting is. She paused. Also, you didn't hesitate to support me once the conflict began. I appreciate that. We're crew, Jonas said simply. That's what crew does. Something in Velena's expression shifted, surprise maybe or recognition. Yes, I suppose it is. 6 months into their arrangement, word reached them through official channels that the varying council of matriarchs had recognized their modified right of claiming as official precedent. Other warriors were requesting similar arrangements, challenging the traditional competitive structures. The message included a formal commendation and a note from the High Matriarch suggesting that they'd started something interesting. Jonas received this news while elbow-deep in a malfunctioning coolant system, trying to replace a valve that had chosen this moment to fail despite being rated for another 1,000 flight hours. So we accidentally started a social revolution, he said, his voice echoing slightly from inside the access panel. Cool. Can someone hand me the plasma wrench? Kairos passed him the tool without comment, though he could see her feet shifting, the varying equivalent of a smile. Later that evening, Jonas stood at the viewport in the common area, watching hyperspace stream past in colors that human eyes weren't quite designed to process. He was thinking about the ceremony 6 months ago, about standing in that circle with 2 strangers and making promises that had seemed impossibly complicated at the time. What are you thinking about? Kairos asked, materializing beside him with the silent movement that still sometimes startled him. Just, back at the ceremony, I was terrified I'd offend everyone no matter what I chose. But now, looking back, I realize that sometimes the right choice isn't one of the options presented. Sometimes you have to create a third option that nobody considered. Velena joined them, carrying 3 containers of the tea that they'd all developed a taste for, a blend from some trade station that none of them could pronounce the name of. She handed one to Jonas, one to Kairos, and kept the third for herself. They stood together at the viewport, 3 people from different worlds who'd been thrown together by circumstance and had somehow made it work. They'd learned each other's rhythms, each other's humor, each other's strengths and weaknesses. I've been thinking, Velena said, breaking the comfortable silence. When the year is up and the formal obligation ends, I don't want to leave. Jonas turned to look at her, surprised. Neither do I, Kairos added quietly. This arrangement has proven more valuable than I anticipated, both professionally and personally. You want to stay, both of you? Jonas asked. If you're willing to keep us, Velena said. The freight business could use a tactical officer and someone who can handle cargo disputes. Plus, Someone needs to make sure you don't adopt any more amphibian colonies. Kyrus added with that subtle humor that Jonas had learned to recognize. Jonas felt something warm expanding in his chest, relief, gratitude, something that felt dangerously close to belonging. I'd like that. I'd like that a lot, actually. They turned back to the viewport, watching hyperspace flow past, and Jonas thought about how strange the universe was. He'd gone to deliver mining equipment and had ended up with a family he never knew he needed. Somewhere in the distance, civilizations were rising and falling, empires were conducting their politics, and the great machinery of galactic society continued its complicated dance. But here, in this small ship hurtling through impossible distances, three people had figured out how to create something that mattered more than tradition or obligation or cultural expectation. They'd created choice, respect, equality. And maybe, just maybe, they'd proven that the best rewards weren't the ones you claimed. They were the ones you built together, one day at a time, with people who chose to stand beside you not because ceremony demanded it, but because they wanted to. The tea was good, the company was better, and the galaxy, for all its vastness and complexity, felt just a little bit smaller and more manageable when you had crew who had your back.